I'm Matt Manny. Thank you so much for joining me as we jump into this brand new series, 40 Days of Compassion. Compassion is not kindness that happens someday. Compassion is kindness that happens today. What we're going to discover in this series as we go through compassion is realizing the difference that compassion can really make, not just in people's lives around us, but the difference that compassion can make in our lives. Compassion, empathy, sympathy, all those words sound similar, and they really sound like they come from the same family, but here's the difference that compassion is compared to empathy and sympathy. Sympathy says, I see your pain. Empathy says, I feel your pain. Compassion says, I want to do everything in my power to relieve your pain. At our church, Greater Philly Church, every spring we go through a spiritual growth campaign. And so this is really kind of the genesis of this campaign is what this study is all about. So we're using this study. This is first launched at our church, and so we are so excited. If you're joining us and you're on your own path of journeying with Jesus, we are so glad for you to join with us. But a lot of what we're talking about is for helping our church grow. There are seasons of life and ministry that our church is going through, and so we are so excited to introduce to our church, to Greater Philly Church, but then also make this content available to you as well. These concepts and this content really has been something that has been in the works for probably about 2 years or so. As I've been praying about our church and the season our church is going through, we're coming through this season of we're learning how to grow our faith in God. We are walking and seeing that God has a purpose for us on this earth. And now, how do we work out that purpose? And our next step for this next season for our church is all about how to take our gifts, our calling, our purpose outside the four walls of the church and really get into the community, get into our neighborhoods, get into our county, and ultimately take these concepts, take compassion to the world. What we're going to find is a lot of these concepts really, we take our inspiration from something called the Peace Plan. And so we do want to give credit to that. The Peace Plan addresses 5 global giants. And really, we find that in our compassion campaign, we're going to find that 5 challenges that reflect those 5 global giants that really flesh out the content for our ministry and for what we're going to go through really reflects some of those concepts. But really, what we've done is we fleshed them out particular to our church and our ministry. And so in this 6-session series, the first 5 sessions are going to address those 5 massive challenges that Jesus addressed in his earthly ministry that he calls us as disciples and followers of him to address even today, 2,000 years later. And then the last session, session 6, is really going to be a call to what is your compassion passion? What is your compassion calling? What is God calling you to do with your life and your ministry and your mission outside of your life, outside of the 4 walls of the church? What is God calling you to do? Session number 1 is all about dealing with spiritual reconciliation. People need to hear about Jesus. And so the big challenge for us is that there's spiritual darkness all around us. And God has called you and I as the church, as followers of Jesus, to share our Jesus story. We're going to look at John chapter 9 as a man who is born blind shares his Jesus story. We're going to talk about in that session that you don't have to have a seminary degree. You don't have to know a lot about the Bible. All you have to know is your story. All you have to share is your story. Then the second big challenge we're going to tackle in session 2 is that of corrupt leadership and self-serving leadership that's all around us. We find in our society, in our world, that there are massive problems, and many times it's easy for us to see those problems as an opportunity to leverage our influence and our leadership, but in a self-serving way. Jesus in his day, he dealt with self-serving leaders who had the opportunity to influence change and to exercise compassion, but it was all about themselves. We're going to look at Matthew chapter 20, where Jesus explains to the disciples that if you want to have massive impact, you want to have local, personal, and global impact, that it takes place with selfless leadership, not selfish leadership. If you want to be first, it comes to be last. If you want to lead, you have to serve. Then in session number 3, we talk about this problem and the challenge of poverty. And what's the answer? It's incredible generosity. We're going to talk about how Jesus calls us as the church really to show that he has a heart for those who are in poverty, those who are poor. And Jesus says, the poor you'll have with you always. But sometimes we can really find ourselves that compassion gets confusing and complex, especially in this area of poverty. We're going to address how we know when we need to help and when we need to not help. How do we know what is relief for helping those in poverty and what is development or discipleship for those in poverty? So if you've ever found yourself questioning and wondering, well, when should I help somebody or when should I not help somebody? Is there a clear way to approach that situation? And we're going to unpack that in session 3. Session 4, we're going to talk about the big challenge of disease and sickness that's ravaged just all around the world around us, people that are struggling and have ailments. And sometimes we can find ourselves, well, I can't heal anybody like Jesus, but what can I do? Jesus' ministry was many times 2 parts, where you find that he would come into a town, a village, or an area. He would teach and he would heal. He would preach and then he would minister to those who are sick. Well, what does that look like today in our society? What does that look like for you in your life? How do we tackle this massive issue of people dealing with sickness all around us, locally and globally? We'll talk about that in session number 4. Session number 5 will get into this 5th challenge for us. And this 5th challenge is the challenge of reaching and teaching the next generation. Specifically, we'll talk about how poverty impacts not just sickness, but it also impacts illiteracy for kids, for this next generation. And really the heart behind this 5th session is about what does it look like to be a mentor, to be a teacher, to be a discipler, to have an apprentice, to pour our lives into someone else's life, specifically those who are coming up as the next generation. We're going to look at this concept where Jesus says, let the young children, let the young ones, let the next generation come to me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. What are we doing to be able to help the next generation find themselves able to hear, able to read, able to study, and communicate in their own way the Word of God to the generation to follow them? It's been said that our faith is just one generation away from extinction. And the goal for us is to follow 2 Timothy 2, verse 2, where Paul tells Timothy, take the things I've taught you and teach them to the next generation, who will be able to teach them to a following generation. And we'll talk about the 2:22 principle specifically in session number 5. And then last of all, we'll talk about in session 6, answering your compassion calling. We find in Romans chapter 12, God says he's gifted each one of us with a compassion calling. We're going to talk about what makes you tick and what ticks you off, because many times the things that light you up, both in a positive way and both in an irritating way, usually in the mix there, at some point there's a crossroads where we find our passion and what makes us tick and what ticks us off, really what motivates and moves us to have compassion. We're going to talk about that and unpack that in session 6. So I'm so glad that you've joined with me. I'm excited for us to jump in, and we'll jump in and talk about in session 1 about, first of all, how to share Jesus with those around us. Thanks so much for joining me.